So it's time to introduce our keynote speaker, Cory Doctorow. Presenting or announcing Cory Doctorow is kind of hard. His Wikipedia article is just too long. He's a Canadian-British author, he's a journalist, he's a blogger, he's a privacy activist. He is very important in the Creative Commons movement, and we're just humbled he found the time to have him. Cory Doctorow, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I want to start with a confession, which is that I'm one of nature's fast talkers, and also I'm very jet-lagged, and I've had enough coffee this morning to kill a rhinoceros, which means that I am apt to start speaking very quickly, and I'm conscious of the fact that I'm not speaking in the first language of most of you in the audience. So when I start speaking too quickly, feel free to do this, and I'll slow down. So, there we go. So, I want to ask today why security research is so dangerous. What is it that prompts companies so often to threaten people who reveal defects in their products? I don't think it's just rage. I don't think that it's just that companies are upset that someone's pointed out that they made a foolish mistake. I think it's a theory you might call the Scooby-Doo, I would have gotten away with it if it wasn't for you darn kids theory of security, which goes like this. You, Mr. Hacker, were smart enough to find the defect in our product, but nobody else in the world is smart enough to find that defect. And if only you'd kept your stupid mouth shut, then that defect would have just sat there until we got around in our own sweet time to fixing it. Now, inevitably, this is dressed up in fancy language. Companies will say, it's not that you criticized our product, it's that you criticized it irresponsibly. Responsible criticism in this context means that you only are responsible when you criticize our products on our terms that we think of as being appropriate. Now, historically, lawmakers and policymakers have been very skeptical of the idea that companies should be in charge of who gets to criticize their products, for obvious reasons. It's not just that even the most cursory understanding of free speech holds that telling the truth about defects in products should be legal, but also that even if you think that under some circumstances security disclosures should not be made without some kind of framework, giving the control of that framework to the company that stands to lose sales once the disclosure is made is bad policy for obvious reasons. They are not the best and most honest custodians of bad news that negatively affects their share prices. But we are at the end of a 40-year shift in how policy around technology works. A 40-year shift in which the desires of commercial operators have increasingly taken on the force of law and have evolved a kind of shadow doctrine in international legal frameworks that's best understood as felony contempt of business model. And this is ushering in a kind of catastrophic age of both bad product design and risk for people who make security disclosures. So to understand how we got here, first let's talk a little about how competition in technology works. It all starts with interoperability, the idea that you can plug one thing into another thing and make it do something that the original designer never intended. So whether that's plugging a USB charger into a car lighter that was never designed to charge a mobile phone, that was in fact invented before mobile phones existed, or creating a product like Google Docs that allows you to open up Microsoft Word files that were created with a product that's a rival product that competes in the market with it. Now, interoperability is not just about using an API or a well-documented file format to plug one thing into another. It's sometimes, and actually often, adversarial. Oftentimes, you are plugging one thing into another, not just without the cognizance of the person who made the original thing, but actually against their wishes. Oftentimes, the people who make a product think of it as the finished product, the product that needs no improvement. But it's very natural for someone who comes along later and sees that product to say, no, actually, that's a part. That's a part that I can use in a bigger product. Things that start off as games consoles that we queue up at the toy store for every Christmas become little apps that run in Windows in browsers that are just a little toy that sits off to one corner, a little process subsumed into something else. And of course, all of the products that we turn into parts to make new products out of also took a bunch of other people's products and combined them using them as parts. And everyone who's done that thinks that when they did it, it was legitimate. But when someone does it to them, it's illegitimate. Every pirate wants to be an admiral, which is why we need adversarial interoperability. It's not enough to make use of products in ways that the product designer envisioned and approves of. In order for competition and innovation to flourish, we need to be able to use products in ways that the original creator explicitly does not approve of. Now, this is very common with computers. That's because computers benefit from this idea of Turing completeness, the idea that every computer can run every program that we can think of, every program that we can express in symbolic logic can be executed on any computer. So that means that plugging existing computers, connecting to their I/O into a new computer, it's just not that hard. It's not hard to reverse engineer an inkjet cartridge or a car part or an insulin pump or a part for an iPhone. And it was once the commonest story in technology. So companies like IBM opened up new markets for mainframes, and they sold those mainframes at very close to the cost of production, but they made all kinds of profits selling things like terminals, printers, modems, and storage devices. And of course, as soon as they did that, competitors like the Digital Equipment Company made compatible products that could be plugged in to the IBM mainframe that were sold not at high markups, but at low markups. And so IBM had to continue innovating, making new products that people would spend money on because their old lines of business had become less profitable over time. And IBM did take countermeasures to stop DEC and its competitors from making compatible products, but those countermeasures were obliterated by Turing completeness. The fact that you could make a computer that was functionally equivalent to another computer meant that ultimately all those efforts to control how your customers used your products and where they shopped for their peripherals would always be doomed. And what that meant is that every time a company discovered a very profitable way to do business, instead of becoming a dominant force, they became a dominant target. They became a kind of reservoir of value that other companies could come along and raid and force them to make something new. Lather, rinse, repeat. And that's how we got that very fast innovation that defined our industry in its early years. But you know, a funny thing happened on the way to the 21st century. The companies that had secured their dominance with adversarial interoperability by raiding other companies' products and making new ones that interoperated with them, they began to find ways to use the law to ban adversarial interoperability. These pirates became successful admirals. They cemented their dominance and they secured unheard of levels of profitability, and with it, the ability to influence policy outcomes or to allow them to crush or buy out potential competitors before they ever really had to compete with them. So this story really gets going in earnest around 1998 when the US Congress passed a law called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. So a very complicated piece of law that was implemented in the EU 3 years later in the European Union Copyright Directive, the EUCD. And this complicated piece of law has one part that I want to focus on today. Section 1201, the anti-reverse engineering, the anti-circumvention rule that bans making products that interoperate with other products if you have to bypass a copyright lock to do it. In the European Copyright Directive, this is Article 6. In the DMCA, it's Section 1201. And what this law says is that bypassing an access control system is a felony punishable by a 5-year prison sentence if that access control controls access to a copyrighted work. And originally, this was a very limited rule because there weren't many access control systems that restricted access to copyrighted works. Primarily, it was things like DVD players or Sega Dreamcasts. And the idea was that you could encrypt a DVD, and then you could have a DVD player that had an access control to decrypt it. And that access control would do some other function, like check to see whether the DVD came from your region, or whether it was bought overseas and imported to your region. And if the DVD and the DVD player, if their regions didn't match, the access control would refuse to play the disc. Now, there's two important facts to note about this. The first is that buying a legitimate DVD overseas and playing it on your DVD player is not piracy, right? It's the opposite of piracy. When you walk into a shop in Bangalore or Tijuana or Colorado or Toronto and you ask the shopkeeper how much the rights holder wants for a DVD, and they tell you that price, and you take that much money out of your pocket, and you give it to the storekeeper, and the storekeeper sends it back to the rights holder, and you get the DVD, and you take it home and you play it on your DVD player, that is the opposite of piracy, right? That is, in fact, what copyright is supposed to do. But if you have an access control system that says that buying a DVD in another country and playing it on your player requires bypassing the access control, and if you have a law that makes bypassing access controls illegal, you can invent new copyright laws. You can basically create a doctrine where anything that you disfavor, anything that you dislike, takes on the force of law. And this ripples through all of these uses for access controls in the early years. You know, the Sega Dreamcast, the Nintendo Entertainment System. Buying a game from an independent software developer and playing it on your Sega Dreamcast, even if it wasn't pressed on a Sega CD pressing machine, is not a copyright infringement. It's the opposite of a copyright infringement. But Sega can insert itself into that transaction by adding an access control that has to be bypassed in order to play a game that wasn't pressed on one of their presses. And then they can trouser a percentage of every game sold by charging for access to that press. And this model persists to this day in things like the iPhone. Now, this is practically a license to print money. Being able to invent laws that are a felony to break, that you don't need a Congress or a Parliament to sign off on, is something that every CEO has dreamt of, right? If only it were illegal to thwart my commercial desires. And so very early in this history, companies started to poke at ways to use the DMCA beyond things like DVD players and Sega Dreamcasts. One of the first places we saw this was with printer cartridges. So Lexmark was IBM's printer division, and just like many of IBM's businesses through the ages, they tried to make a lot of money on their consumables. In this case, they had these toner cartridges that were full of carbon. Now, carbon is not expensive. Carbon is hyperabundant. Our planet is drowning because we have too much carbon. But they wanted to charge a lot of money for this very common element. And so to do so, for these old cartridges, they added a very small, very dumb chip, because this was 2001, and so chips were still expensive. This chip had 12 bytes of memory, and it ran one program, and all that program did is that when the carbon in the cartridge dropped to 0, it flipped a bit that said, "I am now an empty cartridge." And you could put more carbon into the cartridge, but so long as the chip said, "I am empty," the printer wouldn't use it. The printer would refuse to use it. And so Lexmark had a competitor called Static Controls. Static Controls reverse engineered that 12-byte program. It wasn't hard. The program was only 12 bytes long. And they wrote a new program that said, "I'm a full cartridge." And so Lexmark sued them. And they sued them because they said they had an access control that controlled access to a copyrighted work. And the judge said, "I can't find your copyrighted work. Surely it's not the carbon." And Lexmark said, "No, it's not the powdered carbon. It's the 12-byte program." And the judge said, "You know, software can be copyrighted, but 12 bytes of software doesn't rise to the level of copyrightability. It isn't even a haiku. Come back when you have a copyrighted work." Funny story, the competitor that reverse engineered this chip, Static Controls, they now own Lexmark. and they sue people who reverse engineer their cartridges. Every pirate wants to be an admiral. So they said, come back when you have a copyrighted work inside your cartridge. Today we have copyrighted works inside of cartridges. Cartridges have systems on a chip that cost 25 cents, have 50 or 70,000 lines of code, a full-blown Linux installation with a copy of BusyBox with its default passwords intact, and a network stack and everything else just sitting on these cartridges. So in March 2016, Hewlett-Packard, the largest printer company in the world, pushed a fake security update to all of its OfficeJet and OfficeJet Pro owners in the world. You got a notice on your screen that said, tap here to install the security update. And when you tapped it, your printer rebooted, and then as far as you can tell, nothing had happened. Just like every other security update you've ever installed, as far as you can tell, nothing has happened, but you have a warm glow of security. Inside the printer, though, something was happening. A timer was counting down. This happened in March, and in September, the timer went off, and all of those printers that had been patched suddenly stopped accepting third-party ink. The reason that they'd had this timer is the same reason that malware waits a while to execute its payload. They didn't want this 0-day that they'd created and deployed to be discovered by users until it was too late. Effectively, what HP had done is reached into the homes and offices of tens of millions of their customers and kind of smacked them up the back of the head for failing to arrange their affairs in a way that benefited HP's shareholders, and instead arranging their affairs to benefit themselves. Now, Epson, and then a year later, Epson did exactly the same thing, right? So we are now in a situation where routinely companies are abusing update mechanisms to trick users into installing anti-features, and they have the force of law to stop security researchers from finding out what they're doing, and to stop competitors from reverse engineering it and restoring functionality to their users' devices. They're poisoning the well against security updates at a moment in which malware infecting consumer devices is being harnessed into giant botnets that are being used to take down critical pieces of internet infrastructure. And it's not just printer cartridges, it's the whole Internet of Things. Software, as Mark Andreessen has told us, is eating the world, and software is copyrightable. So if you add a one-molecule thick layer of digital rights management, of access control, to your IoT device, such that you have to bypass it to do something that thwarts the commercial desires of the manufacturers, then the manufacturers can use the law to control how you use your product. And of course, hardware business models are very difficult. There's not really a business model for Internet of Things gadgets. The margin for these devices starts at, say, 2%. And then if you're successful, it becomes negative as your manufacturing contractors in the Pearl River Delta and the Pacific Rim start running third shifts where they counterfeit your products and sell them at below the cost they charge you to manufacture them. And so if you're going to raise money to make hardware, you have to go to your investors and convince them that you're going to make your money somewhere else, from service, from consumables, from parts, and especially from data. And so we have these devices that are designed to treat their owners as adversaries, to hide how they operate from their owners, to be off limits to independent scrutiny, that are designed to spy on their owners as much as possible on the off chance that someday someone might buy the company that made it for the data that they've gathered, and that are also designed to extract money from their users by charging over the odds for peripherals, for service, for parts, for consumables, for software. And obviously, this preference that companies have, that you buy your parts, your service, your software from them, that's merely a preference. But when you add a layer of DRM and then you invoke Article 6 of the Copyright Directive or Section 12.1 of the DMCA, that preference becomes an obligation on your users and on your competitors. And so this has created a kind of virus of bad design patterns that have infiltrated the entire IoT, which is how we've ended up with digital rights management in cars and tractors and thermostats and baby monitors and voting machines and pacemakers and implanted defibrillators and insulin pumps. You know, there's no reason it has to stop there. Add a vision system to a toaster, and there's no reason it has to accept unauthorized bread. Add an RFID system to a dishwasher, and there's no reason it has to accept an unauthorized dish. And if you think that sounds weird, ask yourself if it's really any weirder than the company that sold you your phone getting to decide whose software you can run on that phone. You can make every single argument for controlling software on phones that's made in defending controlling software on phones to control bread and toasters, right? Do you know how many kitchen fires are started when people put bagels in sliced toasters? Do you know how many people foodborne illnesses kill every year? How can we promise you that your dishes are really sterile if we can't control which dishes we put in there? How can we expect it to do warranty service on your toaster if you can just put any old bread in there? Do you know how foolish people are? Do you know what people have put in their toasters over the years? How can we trust people to decide any bread they want? So in the early days of the free software movement, we used to divide the world into this two camps, right? We had proprietary software and we had open software. And open software was software that the creator intended you to interoperate with. And they gave you the source in the preferred form for modifications under a license that allowed you to make modifications and redistribute them. And proprietary software was software that before you could interoperate with it, you had to go through the tedious business of reverse engineering it, right? So that was open and closed. But over the last 40 years, quietly, while no one was really looking, we got a new kind of software. And that's software that's illegal to reverse engineer. Software that's not just closed, but software that is so closed that looking at it closely enough to figure out how to make an interoperable product can land you in jail. And the years have not been kind to software freedom. You know, when free software began, the people who espoused it, they thought that they were going to end up being monks, right? That they were taking a vow of poverty because no one would ever pay you to make software that was given away for free. And then the free software movement split. Instead of emphasizing the ethical basis for making software free, we had a new movement called open source that emphasized the utilitarian reasons for making software open. If you make software open, it will be cheaper to develop, it will be more robust. And that was very true, right? The reason we make software open is because if software isn't open, then third parties can't scrutinize it and find the mistakes that you might have made. And you know, having third parties scrutinize your tools and find the mistakes that you've made in them, that's a very old and honorable thing in our world. You know, before we had science, we had a thing that looked a lot like science called alchemy. The difference between science and alchemy is whether third parties got to see your workings. Alchemists did everything that scientists do. They observed a phenomenon in the universe. They hypothesized a causal relationship. I think this makes that happen. They created an experiment to test it. They ran their experiment. They documented what they found, but they never showed anyone their documentation. And so when they made stupid mistakes, they could kid themselves that the mistakes weren't there, which is how alchemists discovered for themselves in the hardest way possible that you really shouldn't drink mercury. And after 500 years of alchemy not producing much, alchemists started publishing. They started letting third parties scrutinize their work. And alchemists finally converted something base into something noble. They converted superstition into science. And so when open source came along and said we should stop making software in the alchemical way by hiding our workings, and instead make it in the scientific way by showing our work to people who don't like us and who reveal the dumb mistakes we've made and who want to discredit us, and if those people can't find anything wrong with our software, then we can trust it. Right? It's kind of obvious in retrospect that that was going to happen. You know, if you hired a firm of engineers to build this hall for you, and they said, all right, but we're not going to show you the math we use to calculate the load stresses on this joist that holds the ceiling up, because that's how we make our money, is with our proprietary math. Well, you shouldn't hire those engineers to build this hall, right? You shouldn't hire engineers to build a hospital for you if they won't tell you where the Ethernet is in the walls, because they want to be the only people who can come in and pull new wire. And in the same way, you shouldn't have a hospital whose software is off limits to your scrutiny, because in just the same way that a hospital whose ceiling has caved in is not very good to help people in, a hospital whose software has stopped working is also a hospital you can't help people with, as we discovered in the ransomware epidemics of the last 2 years. So after this split between free software and open source, what started to happen was at first you had software code improving and also software freedom improving. All of that improvement was available to everyone. But as more and more of that software moved into the cloud, the freedom began to be the exclusive purview of the businesses that were making the software and not the users who were interacting with it. Because the businesses were able to use terms of service and other networked countermeasures to stop you from interoperating with their servers in ways that you chose. And so the fact that you could see the code was irrelevant because you couldn't gain the software freedom to use the code in ways that you wanted. It's not hard to write code to interoperate with third-party services. It's not hard to write scrapers and crawlers that log in and do things that the owner of that service doesn't want you to do. And just like we've made interoperable products for years by making hardware that could talk to other hardware, we've also made interoperable products by making software that could talk to other software. You know, Google wrote a crawler that made a copy of every page on the web without permission from the people who made those pages. When Facebook launched, they made a crawler that logged into MySpace on your behalf and pulled all your waiting MySpace messages from your MySpace queue and moved them into a Facebook queue where you could reply to them, and it would push those replies back to MySpace and say, I sent this from Facebook, why are you still using MySpace? But things got sticky. Terms of service started to take on the force of law thanks to laws inspired by the movie War Games that were passed in the era of Ronald Reagan. And these laws, like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, began to be used to stop people from violating terms of service. And so Facebook was able to turn around and sue competitors like Power Ventures that made crawlers that logged into Facebook to move your Facebook messages into Power Ventures' new social network. And it wasn't just turning terms of service into law that Reagan did. The other thing that he did was dismantle antitrust law. Around the time that Reagan took office, leaders all around the world, Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and others, started to enact laws that limited the kinds of regulation that stopped anti-competitive behavior. Rather than stopping market cornering, buying competitors, forcing competitors out with illicit tactics, horizontal and vertical integration, and tying, all antitrust regulators wanted to do was stop you from fixing a minimum price. You could fix a maximum price at zero, but not a minimum price. And over the years, tech grew up, becoming the first industry to take advantage of this lax antitrust environment. And the tech companies became the first monopolists, though not the last. I mean, we now have 3 or 4 giant car makers, 3 or 4 giant banks, 3 or 4 giant oil companies that have all taken advantage of this regulatory regime. And so we've now entered an era in which your devices are designed to treat you as an adversary, to lock you into arranging your affairs to benefit shareholders, where unlocking the device is a felony punishable by a 5-year prison sentence, where using bots or other compatibility tools to let users migrate from one service to another is also a felony, and where doing anything that challenges a company's business puts you in legal crosshairs. Which brings me to information security. Because these laws don't just give companies the power to control their competitors and their customers, it also lets them control their critics. Section 6 of the European Copyright Directive, or Section 1201 of the DMCA, they're so broadly worded that they make reverse engineering for the purposes of security auditing into a potential felony. Reverse engineering a bootloader, reverse engineering a binary, and this creates a climate of fear where people who know true facts about the security of the devices and services that we use, people we trust to act as our proxies and warn us when these devices are not fit for purpose, are being told by their general counsels that they can't come forward unless the company that they're about to criticize and whose bottom line they're going to hurt approves of them doing this. So this is how we got to the internet security dumpster fire. The whole world is made of computers, and Turing completeness, it means that making computers that are secure is very hard, because we can run every program on every computer, including programs that are malicious. No one's figured out how to make a computer that runs all the programs except for the ones that you don't like, whether those are programs that allow you to infringe copyright or programs that allow you to attack users. Turing completeness has created this intrinsic security problem, and it also means that businesses that are based on controlling users will never be technical business models. They'll always be legal ones, because so long as devices are Turing complete, there will be no technical countermeasure that stops a competitor from opening up your device. Only legal countermeasures to do so. The reason you can't record a TV show off your HDTV on an open PVR, the reason you can't jailbreak your iPhone, the reason that you can't take your car to an independent mechanic, it's not technical, it's legal. So what are we going to do about this? Lawrence Lessig, he talks about this idea that the world is regulated by 4 forces: code, law, norms, and markets. That what's technologically possible, what's profitable, what's socially acceptable, and what's technologically possible, socially acceptable. Sorry, that's the 4 forces, yes. That the 4 forces are what regulate us. And so some of you make code, right? Some of you make code that enables people to pen test or reverse engineer their services to know whether or not it works. And that's a good intervention. Some of you have businesses that are based on independently scrutinizing tools on behalf of people, and that's a market intervention. But we need to have more legal and normative interventions. We need to stop legitimizing the idea of locking people out of using their devices in ways that benefit them instead of the manufacturer of the device. And we need to reform the laws that have made this activity so fraught. And unfortunately, we're running in the opposite direction. So the new copyright directive is now pending. It's in the final stage of negotiation in the European Parliament. It's the first update to the copyright directive in 17 years. And at the very last minute, before the final language was introduced to the Parliament, they added 2 clauses that had been rejected earlier as unworkable and controversial. And one of those clauses says that linking to the news should be illegal unless you have a license from the news company, meaning that news companies get to decide who can criticize their news. And the other one is that offering a platform where people can make a copyrighted work available, like Twitter or Facebook or Google or GitHub, that these platforms have to run copyright filters, where anyone can add anything to a blacklist of works that can't be posted by users, and anything that appears to match that has to be blocked by the platform on pain of great big legal statutory damages. And at saveyourinternet.eu, you can send a letter to your MEP about this, and it has much more detail about this, saveyourinternet.eu. It has the potential to make all of these problems much worse, to cement the dominance of these big tech companies and their ability to control their critics and their customers and their competitors. Because, of course, the only companies that can afford these kinds of measures are the winners in the marketplace today, not the smaller competitors that we rely on to keep them honest. So I work part-time, as you heard, for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. We're one of the many organizations around the world that work on these issues. And these are not issues that we solve individually. They're issues that we solve collectively. So whether your local digital rights group is EDRI, the European Digital Rights Initiative, or CCC or Netzpolitik in Germany, or Quadrature de Net in France, or the Open Rights Group in the UK, I'd urge you to get involved with them, because it's through the collective action of people who understand technology that we're going to make changes. I'm a science fiction writer, and so people often ask me if I'm pessimistic or optimistic about the future. But the one thing I know as a science fiction writer is that predicting the future is a fool's errand. Science fiction writers have made very many predictions, and almost none of them have ever come true. And when I think about it, this to me makes me feel actually rather hopeful. Because if the future is predictable, then what happens will not be affected by what we do. If the future is predictable, it's foreordained. I like to think of the future as contestable, as a place where what we do makes a difference. And it's through the harnessing of collective action that we make those differences. So with that, I'll close out. I'm very honored to have had the chance to speak to you today, and I'd like to thank you all for the work you do in making our devices secure. The internet is too important not to have people of goodwill like you taking a good hard look and independently scrutinizing the systems that are around us to make sure that they are secure, not just because the manufacturers say so, but because independent scrutinizers say so as well. Thank you.
Taking one question.
One question. Is there anyone who has a question?
Let's take one question before the next speaker. Yeah, we talked about yesterday about how Swiss audience tends to be a bit shy. And this is proof. If nobody dares to speak up, I have a question. Matthew Green said a couple of weeks ago on Twitter, we've been mocking digital rights management developers for 20 years now. Waking up now to realize they're winning. What do you think about that?
So I have enormous respect for Matthew, and he's certainly a much more worthy technical expert than I am. He knows far more than I ever will. He's forgotten more than I will ever know. But I think that Matthew, when he talks about this, the piece that's missing is that we have a robust, above-ground, well-funded effort to make DRM. But the efforts to break DRM are underground, non-funded, and illegal to talk about. You can't mention that, the first rule of DRM Breaking Club is no one talks about DRM Breaking Club. So we don't know really what happens if we have a fair fight between DRM and DRM breaking. We don't know what would happen if, for example, Microsoft could legally make an app store for the iPhone, provided that they could break the DRM, and if Microsoft Research was put in charge of that project, right? Or if it were Baidu, or if it were some other giant company with a huge research lab, access to hardware, and so on. If Walmart could put a dongle that hardware jailbroke your iPhone and installed a Walmart app store in the point of sale line for 99 cents, they could stand to make an enormous amount of money. And I think that that upside is so large that you could expect that they would be willing to spend an enormous amount of money figuring out how to make that happen. And so I think that in a world where you have hobbyists attacking giant firms and the hobbyists start to lose, it doesn't tell you much about the underlying technical reality. And we do have this other important piece of this corollary, which is that up until now, DRM has been made at a cost of millions by teams of extremely skilled engineers who spend years on it. And then it's broken in hours by teenagers using hobbyist equipment, right? And so if the DRM is becoming harder to break, it still has this history of being very, very, very easy to break, and that suggests that as a technical matter, it's highly asymmetrical, right? That it's much easier to find a single defect in the whole DRM chain and exploit it than it is to make a DRM system that has no defects in it.
Yeah, get your point. So you're still confident?
Yeah, I'm at least hopeful. And if it turns out that there are firms that manage to make DRM that achieve illegitimate goals, then I think that one of the things we're going to need to be even more certain about is that we have laws that hold anti-competitive behavior in check. If it does turn out that you can use technology to be anti-competitive, then we are going to need laws that prohibit that kind of anti-competitive act.
See that. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.
Cory, Doctorow.